Okay, our next speaker before the break, and I think we have everything ready to go, is Karl Flessa, a professor of geosciences at the University of Arizona. His presentation is entitled Nature's Fair Share Ecosystem Needs and Benefits in the Lower Colorado River and Delta. Professor Flessa.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I also am intimidated by the expertise and experience in the audience. I'd like to start off by taking you all on a field trip. This is a multimedia presentation. That's why there are two of us up here trying to make this work. I realize that many of you have probably not been to the Colorado River Delta and the Northern Gulf of California, so I hope this will work on its behalf. You all know where you are. Now let's see where we can go. Yeah, that's right. The Delta, of course, is in the head of the Gulf of California, an extraordinarily long body of water. And here we're going to sort of close in now on the former estuary, the zone where the fresh water of the Colorado formerly mixed with the Colorado River. Pardon these sort of Google images. These are spliced together. That's just a piece of the mosaic. Focus in here on this island in the mouth of the river, Isla Montague. It's quite a stable feature. It was there with the early explorations in the early 19th century. The river no longer reaches the Gulf of California, yet there is water in the mouth of the river. That's all seawater. Upper Gulf of California has tides in this area that reach 10 meters in amplitude, so that's a lot of seawater moving up and back. I'll be talking a little bit about the Ciénaga de Santa Clara, this constructed wetland here on the margins of the delta. It's not connected directly to the main stem of the Colorado. We're now going to sort of move over a little bit to the west. So again, there's still water here, but that's all seawater. Hypersaline water, as a matter of fact, probably salinity about 40 parts per thousand. Over here in the western reaches of the delta, some of the wetlands associated with the Rio Hardy, a former distributary of the river, now carrying agricultural return flow. Some of the wetlands here where the return flow from the river connects up with the Rio Hardy. We're now going to sort of move up the riparian corridor toward going upstream here. And this patchwork here, these are all the agricultural fields of the Valle de Mexicali. This white line here is the political boundary between Baja California and state of Sonora. Here in the last railroad crossing of the river, there is water in the river. This water is a result of agricultural return flow, not directly from the river itself. Because as you go further upstream, you'll see other portions of the riparian corridor, that spot between the levees here, lacking in water. This white swath through here is an attempt by engineers to control the flow, the direction of the river. You can see how well that worked. Here's another portion of the river that does have water in it, and here on the left-hand side in Baja California, you see some of the irrigation canals in Mexico. We're now moving over back toward the east, and we'll come over the Mexican city, border city of San Luis Rio Colorado. Here, the riparian corridor, this is the U.S.-Mexico border here. This is now Arizona, this is Baja California. I'm going to zoom in on Morelos Dam. It's not a storage dam, but rather a diversion dam. This is where Mexico diverts water for its agricultural needs, agricultural and urban needs. Here now is California, the city of Yuma, and the Yuma Valley and the agricultural fields in the Yuma Valley. And moving now along, can't leave this out, moving on to the west here in California, this is the All-American Canal, so called because it is completely within the United States. Not because it's especially patriotic or anything like that. Along the path of the All-American Canal, there is seepage, and we'll sort of close in on this. This is some of the seepage that is sought to be controlled by an effort to line the canal. That seepage supplies wetlands on both the U.S. and the Mexican side of the border, as well as groundwater in Mexico. The All-American Canal carries water to the Imperial Valley and to the canal that takes up water to the Coachella Valley, the Smoky Day here in the Imperial Valley. But what water is applied to the fields in the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley ends up here in the unwanted child of the Colorado Delta system, the Salton Sea. That ends our tour. Okay, the story is well known. Really, it's upstream dams. They regulate downstream flow. That's the big news here. And it's that regulated flow that permits diversion of water for agriculture and cities in the United States and Mexico. And both within the United States, under the Compact and most aspects of the law of the river, and also within Mexico, there is no specific allocation of water for nature. As a consequence, little or no water reaches the lower river, delta, and the estuary of the river. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about what's left. We're talking about we're not really talking here so much about restoring the delta as we're talking about here sort of keeping at least what's left. What's left here, then I'll talk about water needs, what's been lost since before the dams, and then segue into the concept of ecosystem services as a way of measuring that particular loss. And that will lead me into some of the more, like Jack, I will also end up with a very provocative and speculative finish, also secure in my tenured position at the University of Arizona. So I'll be talking about what's left, which is principally what's left of the estuary, the Cienega de Santa Clara, the riparian corridor, and the Salton Sea. I will leave some of the stories of the Rio Hardy and the wetlands associated with the Rio Hardy to Francisco Zamora, who will be talking later on this afternoon. This is the estuary. It's again, Herbert Hoover famously said, this is back I think somewhere in the early 1920s or maybe late 19-teens, every drop of water that runs to the ocean is wasted. Hoover was wrong. Water that used to run to the northern Gulf of California supported an enormously productive ecosystem. The river delivered nutrients to the system, it delivered sediment to the system, it provided nursery habitat for what are important commercial fisheries. So what's left of the estuary is tiny little bits of brackish water way high up in the system. Right now, as I said before, this is all salt water. Patty this morning challenged my thinking. One of the ways she challenged my thinking is to come up with a species of organism that is possibly less charismatic than a humpback chub. And I offer for you here a clam. You can't get much more non-charismatic than that. But in fact, this is sort of one of the species that's been occupying my studies, that of my students over the years. And a reporter once asked me, well, who cares about clams? And that really stopped me in my tracks. And I realized that people might not care about clams, but they might actually care about the organisms that eat the clams. Turns out that this particular species of clam makes up all of the beaches of the Baja California side of the Colorado River Delta, and used to be enormously abundant in the era before the dams. Like Jack, I'm a geologist, so I divide up time here into the era before the dams we refer to as the pre-Dambrian of the Colorado River system. These abundant populations of clams, care about them or not, nevertheless supported other organisms in the food chain, crabs, snails, and birds. So we've documented approximately a 90% decrease in the population size of this particular species, and there are undoubtedly effects on the food chain as a result. There are commercial fisheries as well. These clams are not harvested, never were harvested for commercial purposes. But there are commercial fisheries in the upper Gulf that have a link to the Colorado River. An extinct fishery, one that's already collapsed, is that of the totoaba. And in a lot of these stories in the upper Gulf of California, there are two culprits. And sort of assessing blame is not always easy, but it's pretty sure that both of them are to blame. One of them is overfishing. That's certainly a major factor. But the other one, as we've shown, or we're beginning to show, is flow of the Colorado River is actually important to these commercial fisheries as well. Totoaba was once an important game fishery as well as a commercial fishery in the upper Gulf. I mean, these fish got really big. This is now a listed species in both the United States and Mexico. The fishery is collapsed. A fishery, these species use the mouth of the Colorado River as their nursery grounds. Corvina is another species of fish actually related to totoaba. It too, its juveniles use the mouth of the Colorado River as its nursery grounds. The shrimp fishery in the upper Gulf of California, larval shrimp also use the upper Gulf of California and the mouth of the river as their nursery grounds. So as river flow decreased, the commercial fisheries decreased. One of the other habitats I want to briefly mention is the Cienega de Santa Clara. It gets a fair bit of publicity these days. It's not directly connected to the main stem of the Colorado. It is, in a sense, a recreated habitat, a beautiful and a valuable one nevertheless, but it's recreated by virtue of its receiving saline groundwater from the Welton-Mohawk Irrigation District in Arizona through a canal that crosses the border and puts its water here on the eastern margins of the delta. The Cienega de Santa Clara is habitat for several endangered species. It's habitat for migratory birds, and it is the foundation of a small but we hope growing ecotourism industry in the region. The riparian corridor, just like it says, it's the former course of the river between the levees. Here you see it sort of from a small plane rather than from a satellite. Runs all the way up, including the border between Arizona and Baja California. The riparian corridor is habitat, again, for wildlife, and it consists largely of flood-dependent natives, cottonwoods and willows, but it's been housing an increasing number of salt-tolerant invasive species such as salt cedar. Salton Sea. This photo illustrates that Salton Sea does have its pretty moments. It is possible. Even though if you get up close, you realize that these beaches are made up of barnacle plates, which is profoundly weird sort of thing. But the Salton Sea does have its values. It receives all of its water largely from agricultural return flow, as here in the New River. And here are the agricultural fields of Imperial Valley and those of the Coachella Valley up north of the Salton Sea. Nevertheless, it does provide important wildlife habitat to the point there is a national wildlife refuge there. And efforts continue to sort of increase recreational use, but there are obviously water quality issues for the Salton Sea. So, this is pretty much what's left. And so the first question, we get asked, or I get asked, is, well, how much water do these remnant habitats need? It's a simple and obvious and really important question, but it turns out it's actually pretty difficult to answer. And without going into the nitty-gritties of all of this, if you really want a short lesson in stable isotope geochemistry, you can see me in the hall, but I doubt I'll have many takers on that one. This is what work that we and several others, a lot of other people have been doing this over the years. We've been working mostly in the estuary, and we've been using the geochemistry of shells and fish ear bones to figure out what the salinities were like and how much water would be needed. During controlled releases, the fisheries respond, so we actually have some measure of sort of how much water would be necessary to increase fishery yield. Ed Glenn, Francisco Zamora, and many others have been working on the riparian corridor and examining the response of vegetation to controlled releases of fresh water. How much fresh water would be needed? The Cienega de Santa Clara, we simply estimate from current inflows, for which we have some pretty good data, and the Salton Sea also estimated from current inflows. What are the numbers? Okay, careful of the numbers here because I'm giving you two sort of different numbers. One is for the restoration of the estuary. This is our preliminary first estimate of what it would take to restore approximately 5% of the original estuary. It's really a small piece of it. We estimate from our studies of geochemistry that you'd need approximately 5% of the annual flow of the river to restore about 5% of the estuary. Riparian corridor, now this is a maintenance flow. That's just sort of to keep things from getting worse than they now are. This is not restoration or rehabilitation. These are the estimates from Ed Glenn and Francisco Zamora's group. Approximately, this is where the 1% for the delta figure comes from, 1% of the annual flow. Cienega de Santa Clara currently receives about 114,000 acre-feet of water a year, mostly from the Mode Canal, from the Welton Mohawk Irrigation District, but a little bit from agricultural return flow within Mexico. And the Salton Sea, again, maintenance to keep things from getting worse, about 1.3 million acre-feet of agricultural return flow. Now, good news and bad news, and who knows? The good news is a little bit of water goes a long way. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be illustrated a little bit more this afternoon. Secondly, don't add up those numbers. Simply because in this system, like most other systems, the water gets used and reused. An awful lot of the water that supports, for example, the Cienega de Santa Clara or the riparian corridor is agricultural return flow. It's already been used. You don't have to sort of add more nice low salinity water to the system. That somewhat brackish return flow is doing rather nicely for those habitats in many cases. Thirdly, there's an increasing supply of water on the scene. As the cities in northern Mexico grow, municipal effluent increases. And actually, treated effluent is pretty good quality. It's certainly more than adequate quality to benefit a lot of these habitats. So don't add up the numbers. Bad news, none of this water is secure. It's all leftovers. It's the stuff that spills out from the system. It is, as is commonly called, operational inefficiencies. But nevertheless, these are actually vital to the preservation of these habitats. As agricultural efficiency increases in Mexico, as it will, that simply means that there'll be less water running off as return flow. That's going to make things worse. Urban growth and out-of-basin transfers, likewise, will remove water from the system. Especially in Mexico, for example, some of the Colorado River water is shipped over to Tijuana, just in the same way that we ship water to Los Angeles and San Diego. And of course, the joker in the deck, climate change, decreasing supply, increasing demand. A bunch of things we don't know on some aspects of the system are issues of timing. When should the water be applied to have the maximum benefit? What quality of water is necessary? What's the maximum salinity that some of these habitats can tolerate? And finally, we have political choices. Do you want to maintain things the way they are? Do you want to restore them? Or are you happy losing even more? So what's lost? I mean, you know, one of the things, again, as a geologist, we've been trying to do is sort of get a glimpse as to what the delta was like in the pre-Dambrian. What were things like then, so we can compare things to the way they are now. So we're going to look at what's lost. And in looking at what's lost, let me just sort of sum up some things. The effects of upstream management on the delta. By and large, certainly the biggest effect has been a conversion of an enormous area into agriculture, primarily, to a lesser extent into cities. What's been lost as a consequence is river flow is reduced and it's regulated. There's no longer this springtime flood, and the quality of the water has changed. It's higher salinity than it used to be. The estuary is much smaller. Salinity in the estuary is much, much higher, and there's less nutrients available in the upper Gulf of California. As a result, commercial fisheries in the upper Gulf have been affected. Overall, both in the estuary and on land, habitat for wildlife has been reduced, and as a consequence of that reduced habitat, population sizes have been reduced, and as a result, therefore, some of them are now endangered in the system, both on the U.S. side and on the Mexican side. And finally, which is a segue into my next section, a decline in ecosystem services. Some of you may have heard of this concept. These are basically the benefits that accrue to society from the natural functioning of ecosystems. And I'll sort of try to quantify that in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to sort of present this particular thought down here, is that I think it's true that most of the economic benefits of river management have been north of the border, and most of the environmental costs have been south of the border. This is not to say that Mexico has not benefited economically from agriculture. It certainly has. This is not to say that there have been environmental costs north of the border, because there certainly have been. But there is nevertheless this disparity. And I'll assert to you that if this disparity were to occur in a river that was completely within the boundaries of the United States, this would be politically and ethically unacceptable. If you doubt that, consider how much money is going into the restoration of the San Francisco Bay, how much money is going into the restoration of Chesapeake Bay, how much money is going into restoration of the Everglades. Okay, ecosystem services. As promised, here it is defined. This is a very anthropocentric view of the environment. You know, this is not a bunch of tree huggers saying how they get rejuvenated by looking at cactus or something like that. You know, this is a very, very Philistine, some people have said, sort of view of nature. What's good in it for me? Well, what's good for society? How does society benefit from natural ecosystem functions? A couple of examples. Fisheries up there, for example. This is an active area of research. Lots of books on this particular topic lately. Some of the more controversial ones have to do with trying to put a dollar value on some of these ecosystem services, quantifying the notion of ecosystem services, including a very recent National Academy report trying to grapple with that particular issue. What are some ecosystem services? They've been broken down traditionally, or not so traditionally because this is a young field, but they've been broken down into four major groups. Provisioning services and regulating services shown here. Provisioning services, an easy example would be commercial wild-caught fish. There's a provisioning service, the functioning of natural ecosystems benefiting society. Regulating services such as climate. Everybody knows that trees take in CO2, produce oxygen, and they store that nasty carbon in their tissues. Okay, that's an ecosystem service that benefits society through its regulation on climate. Cultural services, most obvious one might be recreation. You go to the beach, you want a nice beach to look at, you want a nice beach to play with so your kids can play with. You don't want to mess around with polluted waters. Okay, the one I had a hard time finding an illustration for having any relevance to the delta whatsoever is this notion of supporting services. These are somewhat more esoteric things such as nutrient cycling or soil formation that don't lend themselves well to pretty pictures. But pollination does. And I picked on here, these are flowers of an agave plant. And the agave are pollinated by bats. So if you like tequila, you should like agave. If you like agave, you should like bats. There you are. Now, the trick here, and the most controversial part of this argument, is actually putting a dollar value on some of these services. And this has been done in some very, very controversial papers. I'm not going to ardently defend these numbers, the precision of these numbers at all. I suspect, however, they're probably okay to an order of magnitude. And they're probably okay relative one to another. But in this particular exercise, it's been possible to put a dollar value on the ecosystem services provided by estuaries at about $2,800 per hectare. It's a metric unit. It's about 2.5 acres. Similarly, coastal shelf is out of the reach of the mix of fresh water. It's a much lower value, about $180 per hectare per year. These are the ecosystem benefits that accrue to society. Wetlands and floodplains have the highest value here. Lakes and rivers, somewhat less, but nevertheless still quite high. All sorts of caveats with these numbers, but bear with me. I'll show you where I'm going with it. Now, what we've done using remote sensing and GIS is what we've tried to do is to identify within the lower Colorado basin, principally the basin of the Delta here, all the way up, including the Coachella Valley, down to the upper Gulf of California, is to identify pixel by pixel what use the land is being put to. Today, land is being put to agricultural use, to urban use, coastal shelf, because really there's no more fresh water entering the system. It's not even an estuary anymore. So it functions ecologically much more like an open shelf. Wetlands, lakes and rivers, and desert. Now, back in the pre-Dambrian, before the Colorado River was diverted and made it possible to convert all of these habitats, we had a much simpler system. The estuary was much larger. Wetlands were much more extensive. Lakes and rivers were actually a little bit less because Salton Sea really occupies a lot of territory. And there was a much larger swath of desert. So that's the change in those are the habitats that have been converted. Now, when you convert desert to agriculture, which is certainly done widespread in the Imperial Valley and somewhat to the same extent in the Valle de Mexicali, you apply water to the desert, simple-minded fashion here. You apply water to the desert, you get agriculture. And you actually increase the value of ecosystem services. Not the value of the crops here. This is sort of a separate economic analysis. But the ecosystem services from those agricultural fields. Ecosystem services increase by, say, they double. However, if you convert wetlands and floodplain from their natural state into agriculture, which was certainly also done in the Valle de Mexicali and in the Yuma Valley, you decrease the ecosystem services available to society, and you do so by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. Similarly, when you switch from an estuary, this mixing of nutrient-rich freshwater and seawater, you go from about $2,800 per hectare per year to, again, an order of magnitude less in the coastal shelf. So this is sort of very crude sort of accounting. So before conversion, pie diagram, we're dealing with about 14,000 square kilometers. You simply multiply the wetlands by their value per hectare, the area of the wetlands by their value per hectare, and you sum all these values up. And so you can compare ecosystem services before conversion and after conversion. Doing so comes up with a number, as inevitably this exercise would do. What we have here is annual value in billions of dollars along the vertical axis. Before conversion in the pre-Dambrian, we have a total of about a little less than $11 billion per year. After conversion, a whole lot less. The difference is the annual loss of ecosystem services as a consequence of the conversion of these landscapes through the diversion of Colorado River water. So it's a way of measuring loss of ecosystem services and a way of measuring what's lost. Well, if you thought that was speculative, let me take the next step. I'm going to use that number again to sort of try to figure out what's water worth to the ecosystem. This is an interesting system because there's no practically speaking, there's no rainfall. Depends exclusively upon Colorado River flow for its water. So there's no complicating facts from streams coming in or water falling out of the sky or that sort of thing. Okay. If you want to figure out what the ecosystem-based value of Colorado River water is then in this system, it's a simple equation. Nothing more complicated than division here. It's the annual value of natural goods and services supported by the river divided by the annual discharge of the river. Right? If you do that, and you do the math, we have it, there's our 8.6. I'm just taking the difference. I'm trying to come up with a low number here. I'm trying to lowball this. If you do that and divide it by the long-term tree ring-based estimates of Colorado River flow, you come out to a value of about 54 cents per cubic meter. I put in a white box up there, for those of you who are metrically challenged, the number in acre feet, okay, on the order of $670 per acre foot. Now, I told you I wasn't really going to defend these numbers in any sort of vigorous fashion. I will freely admit that they are probably only good to a plus or minus an order of magnitude. So it could be as low as $67 an acre foot, but it could also be as high as $6,700 an acre foot. Okay? What can I do with that number? Let's compare it, of course. Agricultural users in the Imperial Valley and elsewhere pay on the order of $17 to $34 an acre foot. Urban users in the basin, $300 to $800 an acre foot. These numbers are always changing. They're usually going up, but they're clearly less than $670 per acre foot. But when you pay for water in the Colorado Basin, you're not paying for the wet stuff. You're paying for the conveyance of the water, and you're paying for the treatment of the water. Water, in essence, we have been treating as if it were free. But what I've tried to demonstrate here is that there is, in fact, a hidden cost. And that cost is in the reduction in ecosystem services to society as a whole. So what to do about this sort of thing? I mean, you know, us academics are famous for identifying problems and then leaving the room. So what I want to do is sort of end with a speculative proposal. That is, we pay for water. A radical idea, I know. Convert water to money. For example, I'm just going to start out with a very, very simple aspect of this exercise. Suppose we added a user fee of $1 per 100,000 gallons of water. Doesn't get much cheaper than that. I picked that number because I live in Tucson, and doing so, the average Tucson resident uses about 100,000 gallons of water a year. So that would add to my water bill $1. Okay? The fee, of course, would increase cost to agriculture on a much higher percentage basis. It would increase the fee by $3.25 an acre foot. That's a substantial increase, I quickly acknowledge. But if you do the math here, a little bit of number, a small number like $1 multiplied by lots and lots of users and lots of water volume, the fee would generate about $50 million a year. The water use fee that might support ecosystems. Now, for those of you who are worried about precedents for this sort of thing, in the intricacies of the QSA and the swap between imperial irrigation and metropolitan water, part of the deal was to indemnify the farmers in the Imperial Irrigation District. An environmental surcharge was added on to the transfer of some of that water. That surcharge was then applied to preservation and restoration of the Salton Sea. So there already is, even within our basin, an environmental surcharge on the use of water, at least in parts of it. Okay, there's that $50 million a year figure. You know, double it if you want. $2 a year, I'll pay that. It could be $100 million. And just start off with this particular number. What would that do? That would create a fund to support conservation, but conservation for in-stream use. Not conservation to support increasing development, not conservation to increase agriculture, but conservation for in-stream use. This really takes a page from the cities. What that ecosystem fund could do would support capital investment in water efficiency, but the water thus saved would be kept in the ecosystem and support the ecosystem that way. And finally, but not a small virtue of this wild idea, is the observation that money moves across borders much more easily than water. Thank you very much.
We have lots of time for questions, so we'll open it up.
Can we see the movie again? Okay.
Please remember to repeat the question.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
You didn't mention the human desalting plant. Does that have a future in this project?
The Yuma desalting plant. We have a sort of a much more expert on the Yuma desalting plant here in the audience than I. Let me say, the Yuma desalting plant, I believe, today is the 2nd of March, has begun a trial run of the desalting plant, a 10% run of the desalting plant, to check out, basically, see how well it works. thanks to funding from the Central Arizona Project, we are monitoring the effects of the likely increased salinity of water that goes to the Cienega de Santa Clara. Excuse me, I'll back up. The desalting plant is initially going to be using water from the Welton Mohawk Irrigation District, water that normally would go straight to the Cienega de Santa Clara and support that particular habitat. When you desalt some of that water, you're going to increase the salinity of what remains to go to the Cienega de Santa Clara. Now, at a 10% run, it's probably not going to have a really big effect. But again, thanks to CAP funding, we're monitoring the effects of that on the Cienega. Desalting Welton Mohawk water is only one of the options for the desalting plant. It could also be desalting Yuma groundwater. There are a number of options for running the desalting plant that would not cause harm to the Cienega de Santa Clara or other parts of the system. Other questions? Yes?
Do you have a sense of pre-Hoover Dam, how much irrigation occurred in the Imperial Valley and
There was certainly, the Imperial Land Company had already established farming in the Imperial Valley, and the infamous 1905, 1907 flooding of the Colorado River into the Salton Sea is one of the things that prompted political pressure to construct Hoover Dam so that downstream flow could be regulated such that those sorts of breakages through the canals, through the irrigation system would no longer occur. There was already some irrigation. I don't know how much, maybe somebody else here does. Okay. What is that relative to now?
About the same.
About the same?
About the same. Hoover Dam has nothing to the Imperial Valley in terms of irrigated land.
Can you repeat that response?
The response was, gentleman from the Imperial Irrigation District?
No, I'm just a lawyer for the farmers.
Just a lawyer. Told me that 450,000 acres were in agriculture before Hoover Dam. There are about 450,000 acres in agriculture now.
were they irrigated in 3 months?
Oh, yes. So the California versus Arizona established.
Yes. Other questions? Sid.
I don't want to blast you out, but I'll be loud so people can hear me, Karl. One of the things I have found in trying to solve water problems in the Colorado River Basin is you need to spread the benefits and the responsibilities across the basin.
Right.
So that's not only the 7 basin states in the United States, but that's also Mexico. So when you were talking about your concept of adding $1 per 100,000 gallons, I think it was.
Right.
And you came up with 50 million. Did you spread that to all beneficiaries of the water in the 7 basin states and in Mexico? Did it include agriculture? Did it include M&I uses? Did it include, on both sides of the word, did it include ecotourism? Because that's an industry that benefits.
It benefits from it, that's right.
I think the solution, I'm intrigued with your concept, but to have any chance, in my experience of working, everyone who benefits has to pay, and there's, at some level, and there's always a problem with distributing the responsibilities as well as the benefits.
Yeah, that's a very good. Did everybody hear that?
Not the
Or am I going to have a challenge? Not in the other room.
Yes.
The question was, I'll try to condense this as best I can. The question was, okay, here's a fee that would be collected from every user everywhere, from all the way in Wyoming all the way into Mexicali. Politically speaking, these sorts of fees are more likely to happen if the benefits from such fees are also distributed throughout the water users in the basin. Have I given any thought to that? I guess was the question. Yes, I have given thought to that. Do I have an answer for you? No, not entirely. I'll retreat to my ivory tower in a few moments. My idea here is to put this idea on the table. You're absolutely right about the political feasibility of this, depending upon everybody seeing that there's going to be a benefit. Nobody wants to pay even $1 if they're not going to get some benefit from it. Part of the problem in the whole Colorado River Basin system is that so many of the users of its water are so physically removed from the water itself. The only city that's sort of really on the river is Las Vegas. L.A., Tucson, people turn on their taps. They have frequently no idea that this water is coming from the Colorado River. So they don't really sort of have that same sort of connection. Now, when you're in Mexico, it's really quite different. I mean, there people sort of have not only a proximity to the river, they really sort of see its immediate benefit. So there's that problem that the population is dispersed, although the benefits from ecosystem restoration that would be supported by such a fund would be at the river itself. I recognize that as a problem. I don't have a solution. The only thing I can think of is that large portions of the United States population think that we should preserve the Arctic Wildlife National Refuge. And essentially, in essence, our tax dollars support that, even though most of us citizens are never going to see it. We're never going to benefit from it except in our knowledge of its existence value. So some of that is there, but I certainly agree with you with the political aspects of it. Yes?
Since the Salton Sea is kind of a recent thing, and it doesn't really seem to benefit anybody, has there ever been any thought of draining it and diverting that water that flows into it back toward the river?
I think some people would dispute the notion it doesn't benefit anybody. It is a valuable agricultural. The question was, who cares about the Salton Sea? Is that a brief abstract of your question? Why not just sort of turn the water around and pump it back into the river? Well, right now you've got water in there that's more saline than salt water, more saline than seawater. So pumping that water back would be actually harmful to most of the other systems downstream. So that's not a quick solution to it. It does perform a valuable service as an agricultural sump. It does provide habitat for endangered species, for migratory waterfowl. So it does have a benefit. And furthermore, as some recent analyses have shown, if you were to actually sort of drain the Salton Sea, either intentionally through the sorts of thing you're talking about, or simply by letting it dry up, you've created other environmental problems from the dust that would go into the air. This has been a problem that's recently been addressed in the Owens Valley in California, for example. Yes?
I apologize because this may be a question for the previous speaker, but I think maybe the thread will run throughout. On the subject of managing Hoover and Grand Canyon dams as combined entities, I've heard the argument made that the actual water loss from evaporation would be less by having one full dam than two half dams, and that the actual power production would be far greater from one full pool than two half pools. And hopefully that can be answered to the question.
Okay. The question is having to do with the joint management of Lakes Powell and Mead with regard to water and with regard to evaporative loss. Is one better than two or something like that? I'll give that to Jack, because I can't answer that question, but you're going to have to either really bellow or come up to the microphone, because there are folks upstairs who might be interested in the answer.
Well, there's probably too many Bureau of Reclamation employees in the audience that I should be very careful. I think that on first principles, it's all about surface area. So if you combine all the water in one place and your total surface area in relationship to the volume stored is less, then maybe you offset the fact that it's a hotter climate at Mead, or at one place or the other. So I think that first principles tell you there's less evaporation if you put it all in one place. And as for electricity, the amount of electricity produced is proportional to the flow times the fall of the river, fall of the water. And I'm not sure how that works out, but maybe that's the case.